Saludos, bienvenidos a la Biblioteca Nacional. Welcome to the British Library. As we enter the happy phase of reopening our doors to the public, please check the website for details. Tonight we're online, but we're opening our minds' doors to the Spanish-speaking world, all around the world. And I'm really excited to be bringing you a gourmet tasting menu. Thanks to Granta's new publication, The Best of Young Spanish-Language Novelists 2, available right here online. Buy it now. And please enjoy tonight's conversation in the majestic hands of the director of the Booker Prize Foundation, Gabby Wood. Over to you, Gabby.
I am here with, well, let's say first, Valerie Miles, co-founder and editor, co-editor of Granta en español. She founded it almost 20 years ago, and she'll be telling us a bit more about that, but more particularly the person, the brains, I would say, behind this selection, and having been part of the selection process, as Valerie very kindly invited me to be, I can attest to her tireless curiosity and extremely nuanced critical mind. And then we have Carlos Fonseca, one of the best of young Spanish language novelists and an absolutely dazzling writer. I almost called you an enfant terrible, Carlos, but you know, you're not terrible or an enfant particularly, but you know, the dazzle is well known to anyone who has read him in English. He's one of the few people in this selection who has been translated into English. I would highly recommend, if you haven't read them, his two novels, Colonel Lágrimas and Museo Animal is translated as
Natural History.
Natural History, right, exactly. And translated by none other than Megan McDowell. We have them all stacked up for you. And Megan is a multi-Booker Prize listed translator. She is also the translator of Samanta Schweblin and Alejandro Zambra and Mariana Enriquez, all of whom, I mean, I say this from a Booker Prize point of view, have sort of passed through one way or another, and she is currently on the shortlist for the International Booker Prize. And then we have Cristina Fuentes, who is the director of the International Hay Festivals and also the person behind Bogotá 39. There have been two of those, so they are sort of parallel lists almost, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The cutoff for Bogotá 39 is the age of 40, and the cutoff for the Granta list was 35. So there's a sort of interesting cusp where some people fell away or were included in one or the other. And so thank you all for joining me. Valerie, can you tell us, you wrote a brilliant introduction to this issue stroke book, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the process and how it differed from what you did 10 years ago.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Gabby, for that lovely introduction also. And thanks to the British Library for having us today. It's very exciting to be here. I also, before I begin, I just have to say thank you to Sigrid Rousing for giving me the opportunity to do this. She's been a force behind the Spanish Granta and somebody who's encouraged us very, very much. Without her, this wouldn't be possible. And the Granta team also, who I love working with. It's a joy. I learned a lot from them through this project this time and the other time too. But I need to just really thank them so much for the leap of faith and the vote of confidence. We began this list, we started, of course, a lot. I say it took 10 years because it's since 2010, we knew that we wanted to actually arrive at 2021 to be able to do this list. And everybody who works with literary magazines knows how difficult it is to keep something over time. And one of the things that Granta has done in its 132, I think, year history is, remained as kind of this testimony to literary life and intellectual life over more than a century. And so, of course, we had something really big there to start Spanish Granta with. But we knew that the mission of British Granta, which was very much in 1979 when it was, reformulated with Bill Buford and Pete DeBalla, was to open a transatlantic conversation between the British writers and the US writers. And that that mission fit perfectly with the idea for the Spanish Granta. And the fact that we noticed that there was a gap between the Spanish writing and Latin American writing, and they weren't reading each other. And so we thought this was a marvelous instrument to fulfill that same mission that the British Granta had with one of the great transatlantic languages, no? And so that's how Spanish Granta got started. It took us a while to get to our first list. We launched the issue, our first issue in 2003, and we did our first list in 2010. So we had to kind of prove ourselves to British Granta that we had what it took to be able to do something like that. And then, we came along with 2021. We had no idea that there was going to be a global pandemic when we started thinking about this. How could you imagine something like that? So we actually had to very quickly reorganize the way that we did it. In 2010, of course, people sent their books in, we read the physical books. There was no social media, so we had to do a lot of prospecting. We had been several years working in Spanish, but Granta still, we were still establishing the reputation and the prestige. And so by 2021, after the first list did so well, the second list was already a little bit easier for us to move it into the digital sphere and work that way. So on the 2010 list, we were very lucky. You could say beginner's luck, or we just had a great jury that read very well, but we chose writers like Alejandro Zambra and Samanta Schweblin, or Olo Isharak, Andrés Neuman, Andrés Barba, some writers who have really gone on to become, the great writers who have won several prizes, like Samanta Schweblin, who's a 2-time Booker finalist. Without going
Megan's correcting you. Megan,
with Megan.
Schweblin,
with Megan, exactly. And Megan's absolutely amazing translations. So we had a big responsibility for this list to, once again, prospect and be careful, have a lot of responsibility towards the language and towards the talent that's in it. So we started in March. We received over 200 candidacies, of which just shy of 200 were actually eligible. And so we started reading. The jury met, in which Gabby, you were a witness. And we came to our list. Our last deliberation was at the end of July. So after that, this was a little bit different this time, because there was a second part to the list, which was that we had the first selection, and we decided that was going to be a little bit of a short list, and it depended on what the writers delivered as their text. The text had to also pass the muster, and to be able to be added into the final list. So that's what we have. 25 writers. The first list was 22. This time was 25. The first list, there were, I think, 8 different countries represented. This one, there's 13, so it's a much more diverse list. The centers of power were reduced and changed quite a bit, actually.
That's really interesting.
And we have substantially more women on this list than on other lists. And perhaps one of the really interesting things is that we also have a writer from Equatorial Guinea on this list, which we are really excited about, because he brings in a whole new dimension of this absolutely fascinating language that is Spanish, that's spoken in so many different places.
Yeah, I really remember that. I mean, I was so struck by that, not just the writing, because, and there was one book in particular, sort of gangland book, but the language and the sort of weaving of what it felt like many different languages into one, and just the very fact that he existed, this writer. Yes. I mean, it makes you think, what does it mean for someone in that place to speak Spanish? Have we forgotten that Spanish is spoken in that part of Africa, pretty much? what kind of Spanish has been inherited, well, you make the point about a sort of very classical Spanish, which has been inherited, I suppose, from at a distance. I mean, it almost doesn't change, but then it really does, because it is so mixed in with, you know, local forms of speech. So I really did think that was extraordinary. We should name him Estanislao Medina Huesca, right?
Exactly, Estanislao Medina Huesca. He did bring something absolutely new to the mix, and it's very interesting because there are so many local autochthonous languages like Fang, but there's also Portuguese. They also speak French. So there's also the mix of the blend of the autochthonous languages, and then also of, you know, the European languages. And so you have this like history, the colonial history that also blends with the local history. And the use of Spanish, yes, that it's in an area that is so kind of remote from the, you know, the other parts of Spanish, that there are some things that have remained. You know, it's like in Mexico. Mexico, for example, they use this word called platicar, which is actually very old Spanish. Which means,
no one else used that word. What? No.
No, it's a very old. In Spain, we don't use that word, but it's actually just from its old Spanish that it's just not used anymore. So it's that's one of the fascinating things when you have a language and so many permutations and so many different traditions and histories. It's in the language itself, and so Spanish is really one of the only languages that has so many countries, and now talking about Latin America, in such a, you know, in one continent with so many different traditions and so many different other languages that blend in, all of the indigenous languages. Bolivia, for example, has 34 co-official languages, 34. So all of these languages are blending in with the Spanish in all of the different countries. And what we saw in this issue, or in this selection, is that the writers are making full use of that.
Yeah, thank you. We might come back to that, Megan, because I'm interested in these sort of Spanishes and what you do with that when you're translating them into one English, or perhaps you aren't, you know, perhaps there are also many Englishes. But before we get there, Cristina, I wanted to ask you a bit about Bogota 39, because that, I mean, it was not long ago. In fact, I think I know I wrote the introduction to that latest collection, which was 2017. And there are certainly some writers in there who are not in here, and who have become very well known. So Valeria Luiselli is in there. Well, Paulina Flores, I think, is in both.
Not in Bogota 39.
Okay, I misremembered that, but there's certainly, Carlos, you're in both.
Yes,
but you know, so there's a kind of cusp, right? There's a cusp of, you know, people who are too old, or people who didn't quite fit the. I think you mentioned this, Valerie, that Valeria, for example, was writing nonfiction before, or essays,
right?
You know, so Cristina, how does it look to you, having collected also 2 volumes of young, brilliant Spanish language writers?
Thank you, British Library, for having us. Thank you, Gabby. And yes, basically, we did like 2 selections similar to Granta, in the Granta spirit. The first one was in 2007, when Bogota was UNESCO World Capital, UNESCO Capital of the Book. The mayor of Bogota proposed us to do a Hay Festival, and we say no, the Hay Festival belongs to Cartagena de Indias, but instead, let's do this project, select and celebrate 39, not of the best, but 39 of the most interesting writers from Latin America. That was a selection more regional based. It was Latin America, and as well, Latin American writers writing in different languages. In the first selection, for example, we have, Diaz or Daniel Alarcón. In the second selection, we have Carlos Javier Maura. So, so English speaking was, we got as well Brazilian authors were included as well. And it was a lot of fun. In 2007, the interesting bit was getting them together. At that point, Latin America was very divided. Young Colombians didn't read young Uruguayans, young Mexicans. The publishing house, the publishing sector in Spanish worked very much Spain, Latin American Spain. But there was hardly connections between the countries. That was 2007, the same as Valerie was saying, before the internet time. And then I think the main thing of that project was getting them together. It was a very, very important meeting for all of them. They didn't know each other, and they start getting to know each other. They start to read each other. That was the first selection. And it was very important because afterwards, each of them went to the countries, and each of them has some power in the local book fairs, and they invited the others. So, you know, the whole publishing sector has changed a lot in 10 years. In 2017, we did the second selection, another 39 writers under the age of 40. So it's a massive selection, much bigger than Granta. And we realized that almost all of them knew each other already. Latin America speaks each other a lot. Many of them were already translated from the first list at the moment of selection. I think Juan Gabriel Vázquez got translated a year after, but they were not, any of them were translated, of course, apart from Daniel Arcon and Juno Diaz. And the second list, I will say, I don't know, maybe 40% of them were already translated. And as well, it was very interesting to see in the first list, the majority were published by Spanish publishing houses, outlets in Latin America. And in the second list, 10 years later, the majority were in independent publishing house that has improved a lot in Latin America, and they get the most literary talent. And I don't know, there were different groups as well. The second group was, you know, they felt writers. Many of them has gone through creative writing schools, for example, in the States or in I don't know. It was very interesting for us to see the whole different context of both lists and both anthologies. And the list, how do they coincide? I look at Bogota 39, 2017, and 9 of those authors were born after 85, and 5 of them coincides with the Granta list. So that's quite a lot. Yeah, it's quite a lot taking into account. We as well have got Brazilians. We got, you know, the Granta list has got as well Spanish from Spain. In our Bogota list, we don't include Spanish from Spain. And, you know, those authors are Carlos Manuel Álvarez, Martín Felipe Castañet from Argentina, Carlos Fonseca, Mónica Ojeda, and Diego Zúñiga. And I don't know, I have enjoyed a lot reading the Granta list. From the 22 writers, I didn't know, I mean, and I think I know quite a lot of Latin American and Spanish literature. I didn't know at all 8 of them.
Of the 25.
And, you know, I found them from the 22, no, 25, sorry. 8 of them I haven't heard about. And I think that's great. That's great to highlight that talent, even for people in the trade, you know, that, you know, I love the Colombian one. I don't know, I have found the you know, we can talk about that later, but the story is fascinating. It has been a big discovery and a pleasure to read.
Great, that's really good, Valerie, isn't it? It's really exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting because we really did want to prospect. I mean, we felt our job, as Gabi knows, we felt our job was really one of prospecting, and we had the opportunity to really try to look for writers who were coming from places that perhaps we didn't know about or hadn't had the chance to emerge properly. You know, we were looking for unusual voices. We were looking for writing that, like, powerful writing that has a lot of attitude. We were looking for, they say in the introduction, a lot of attitude.
There is,
you know, yeah, isn't there, like, attitude, you know? And I think it would have been easier to go towards, you know, everyone from 1985 and already emerged and with a couple of novels to their name. And that would have been like, we could have like rested there and been very easy. But we actually decided as a jury that we were going to be a little bit, we were going to take risks and follow our hunches and read with an eye towards the future. And so that's what we did.
Yeah, and the youngest is Irene, where is she?
Reyes Noguerol.
Noguerol, yeah, exactly.
Exactly, from 1997. She's only 23.
Amazing. Carlos, I mean, this is Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying about both of you, about sort of Spain speaking to Latin America, both of these places speaking to the English-speaking world, influences from elsewhere, particularly when you were talking about West Africa, you know, French, Portuguese. Famously, Carlos, you know, Vargas Llosa said he never thought of himself as a Latin American writer until he got to Paris, you know, and then suddenly there was a reinvention. I mean, how do you situate yourself? Who do you feel that you're sort of speaking to? And I suppose just very fundamentally, do you consider yourself a Latin American writer, and what does that mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, like, thanks so much, Gary. Thanks so much to the British Library, and of course to Granta and to Jerry for selecting this list. I was just, right now when I was hearing Cristina speak, I was thinking something changed here. And I was thinking that in Bogota 39, 4 years ago, I was one of the youngest, and now I'm one of the oldest. So this is not fair, but thanks so much to everybody. And with regards to your question, Gabi, it's a very good question, and I think it's a very hard one. And going back to Vargas Llosa, I think that, you know, you stated it precisely in the introduction to the Bogota 39 anthology that came out 3 years ago with One World, when you said, right, you know, a while back in the 1960s, 1970s, to be a Latin American writer meant, or at least for the marketplace, that like you were gonna like be writing magical realism, right? And that was the definition almost. And I think at one point that became like a straitjacket and quite restrictive for writers. But I think my generation, even the generation that came before, the Granta and Bogota 39, so the previous generation, we were quite lucky because we never had that burden. I think that, you know, those writers that were working in the 80s and 90s that were quite brave started kind of breaking loose out of that straitjacket. And here I'm thinking about like members of our jury, right? Like, you know, when I think of narratives and narrators like Horacio Castellanos Moya, I think of Castellanos Moya closer to Bernhard than I think of Castellanos Moya closer to like Vargas Llosa, for example. Chloe Regis, I think of her writing closer to Sebald than perhaps to Carlos Fuentes. In the case of Rodrigo Fresan, closer to Pynchon than perhaps to Garcia Marquez, right? So I think like they really kind of paved the way. And of course we had Bolaño, right? When you see a novel, I was trying to pick like a big book to put below my computer to like look nice, and I had 2666. I didn't use it at the end to be able to show
very
it.
handy.
But yeah, it has come extremely handy during the pandemic. But yeah, when you have a novel like this that is capable of being extremely Mexican, extremely Latin American, but at the same time extremely global, then you find new solutions, right? So I think now, as you mentioned in the introduction, as Valerie stated in her introduction to the present Granta volume, I think we have multiple styles that could go in so many directions. And I was telling Valerie earlier today that like one of the things that like I was impressed when I was reading the anthology was that her editing was so wonderful, because nonetheless, despite this multiplicity of styles, she was able to find like a beautiful kind of order that, without seeming like, you know, like linear or anything, was able to construct some like beautiful story between like motifs that appear, disappear, something more. I think, Valerie, you mentioned the word constellation. I think it's completely right. Something more musical. So that would be, I think, you know, each author would have like a different answer. But in my case, you know, I have that double nationality thing that like makes nationality a bit like, you know, anxiety producing for me. I was born in Costa Rica. I moved to Puerto Rico because my mother's Puerto Rican, my father's Costa Rican. And at some point, you know, I think like in Puerto Rico, they consider me to be a Costa Rican writer, and in Costa Rica, they consider me to be a Puerto Rican writer. So, and nationalism was like very kind of anxiety producing for me. So instead, I kind of like quickly opened, you know, like my readings to other kind of traditions. Perhaps that's why more of a Pan-American tradition or a Latin American tradition. So, you know, my readings of like writers like Ricardo Piglia, the Argentine author, or like the amazing like Mexican author Cristina Rivera Garza, I think were just as influential as reading Marta Ponte in Puerto Rico or Carlos Cortés in Costa Rica, with Sebald in the mix and Cartarejo, right? Like, so I think like we're very lucky, and like that we owe to those people that kind of opened the way before us.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting, these open borders. And we should tell the audience also that you've come sort of, you know, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico via, you know, Stanford, Princeton, and Cambridge, right? So there's a whole, you know, there's a whole map just within you. But I think, you know, I was very struck. Well, we can talk a bit about the story that you have in this selection as well. But, you know, to incorporate Europe, the idea of history in ruins, archives, finds, which is a preoccupation of yours, I know, anyway, you know, and then thinking, because he's on my mind, and I don't know him, haven't met him, but Benjamin Labatut, who is on the, right, the International Booker Shortlist at the moment, who actually, you know, talks about the same, I think, mathematician who inspired, I mean, not directly, but, you know, there's an overlapping preoccupation, right? There.
Yeah, definitely. I think that like signals that there's an overlap in readings, right? I think we were both reading Seabolt, and we both saw the possibilities that could have upon, like, you know, writing within Latin America, and why not adopt Seabolt as a Latin American, just as like Cuba could hypothetically adopt Calvino, because I think Calvino was born in Cuba, so that would be a wonderful way of rereading the Cuban tradition, I think.
That is a great idea. And also, I remember talking to Andrés Neuman, who was in the previous list, and he said something about how all Argentinians read Edgar Allan Poe when they were growing up. And I thought, why is that? What is going on here with Edgar Allan Poe? And of course, I realized that Cortázar had translated Poe into Spanish. And so you see how these things cross borders, right? How they end up in people's childhood readings and then influence a new generation. That seemed, you know, fascinating to me, and you know, and without further ado, Megan, you know, speaking of translations, influential translations, what do you make of all that? I mean, I was going to ask you about working with Carlos in particular, and also since you have, I think, is this right, Valerie, more translations in this volume than any other single translator. Perhaps you could compare that to working with other writers just on this list. But go ahead.
Well. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. This event and this event in particular, and the event of this collection is meaningful for me because, you know, there is no age limit on translators. So I was able to participate in the first one, which was done right when I was starting my career. You know, I had published the first book of Alejandro Zambra's translation, and then we included an excerpt from his second book in this. And now here I am 10 years later, and, you know, 3 of my writers were chosen for this edition, and I'm just thrilled and delighted and so proud of them. And yeah, I translated 3 of the stories in this collection, and that's because, you know, I already had a working relationship with all of them. You know, with Carlos, I think is the longest one. We, what year was it, Carlos, that you sent me your first book?
I think 2013. I hadn't even like gotten a contract with anybody, so it was like pure, like really believe in me from Megan. So I'm thankful.
Tell us how that worked. Sorry to ask you to scroll back a bit, but how did you meet each other? Carlos, you ended up sending stuff to Megan. Can you just tell us how that took place?
This was when I was living in Switzerland back then, and he contacted me out of the blue and asked if he could send me his novel, and I said sure. But what I wasn't expecting was to get it was a self-published novel that I think he had 5 of, and he sent it to me, and I read it and I loved it, and I said sure, let's see what happens. I'll translate it. And he came to me, I think, because he said he wanted Alejandro Zambra's translator. So.
Exactly, like it was interestingly connected to what F39 and like Granta, because I had read Zambra's novels and read like Megan's translations, and I was like, she's good, and Zambra is very good. So, so if I want to be a writer, I might as well hang out with the crowd.
So that was it was kind of a big risk, because as he says, you know, he hadn't even published the book in Spanish before, and that's the only time I've ever done that. But then obviously the book was Corona Lágrimas, and it got published by Anagrama, and then it came out in English in the States.
I have a matching one that we can hold up to.
And now, just this past year, we've published this masterpiece, which is Natural History, And
I only have this one. Yeah, we're doing it. The whole show is going wrong here.
So yeah, just from the start, I've been impressed. You know, Carlos is just a really ambitious writer who, you know, he just has, like you touched on before, has this kind of global imagination that tries to tell stories that encompass, you know, history and cross boundaries, and this particular story and the collection, I think, was pretty both timeless and timely, because, you know, it focuses on a natural disaster, a hurricane, but the sentiment that it expresses, I think, really can speak to our moment and now in the pandemic. You know, he talks about the tedium of boredom that returns us to a primitive state, and I think we can all kind of relate to that.
Megan, yeah, absolutely. Valerie was talking about prospecting, right? This notion that you're going out in search of something, you know, will you find gold? For some translators, it's a bit that as well, right? I mean, do you find, to what extent are you a kind of ambassador and advocate to the English-speaking world for writers where you're the first line of discovery?
Well, I like that idea that I'm an ambassador, so you know, I'll accept it. But I don't know that I can claim to be the first line, because the thing that really helps me is being in Chile, being here on the ground in Chile. And so,
sorry, can I just interrupt? We should have said that. We should have said at the start that you were in Santiago, just so everyone knows. You know, that is. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, I do tend to have a focus on Chilean writers and Argentine writers. You know, obviously I go beyond that, but, you know, a little what Christina was talking about, it's really important to know people. So, you know, my writers are people who live down the street from me, and they're friends of mine. And this is a lot easier now. You know, I can know people who I don't live in the same country as, but just going to bookstores here, going to book fairs in Latin America, meeting publishers, meeting editors, always asking for recommendations. You know, I wish that I could read everything. I wish that I really could read everything. I wish I could translate everything that I like, but obviously I can't. But I do feel like there's a benefit to being here with your ear to the ground. And, you know, there's a kind of groundswell around the writers, and they get picked up on these waves, and then you kind of hear about it. I'm not the first line. You know, I would say, like someone was saying, the first line is probably independent publishers who are really on the forefront. But I definitely pay attention to that. Yeah.
But yeah, let's hear a bit about the independent publishers. I mean, I only know Mexican ones, but, you know, like Sexto Piso, or they're just incredibly impressive. I mean, I don't know, Carlos, so you were published with Anagrama, so but do you have a sense of that that culture, the independent publishing culture?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was like one of the game changers, as Christina said. Like now, like, you know, we had a huge problem with distribution in Latin America, that even, like, you know, the big publishing houses, like, they would publish nationally, but it was very hard to distribute books. And like within that setting, like I think independent publishing house like provided a solution. So somebody like an amazing writer like Lina Meruane was published, you know, by Penguin Random House in Spain, but by so many amazing like publishing houses, indie publishing houses in Latin America. And that made possible, you know, like a real kind of like trans-border and transnational kind of dialogue, as Christina was saying, between different places. And I think that's what like an anthology like this one achieves, right? It's also a meeting place. It's right now, like this past week, I was like reading the anthology, and I must say I have discovered so many authors, right? And that's one of the beauties of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Valerie, going back to the map, what's going on in these places? I mean, I remember there are lots. I mean, you mentioned that there are 4 Mexicans as opposed to 1, but I won't get fixated on Mexico. But also the Cuban story, which was, I remember we had this conversation, right? Can we really have 3 Cubans? And then, but well, you know, they're different. There's one Cuban who's in Cuba. There's one Cuban who's in Miami. There's one, right? I mean, can you tell us a bit about where you see things brewing and what you make of that?
Well, you know, it's very funny because there were some people, you know, commenting, oh, everything's coming from the centers of power. Of course, people who hadn't read the introduction and don't kind of realize, you know, didn't get a chance to really read the issue and know where these writers are coming from. But it's very clear. For example, there are 6 writers from Spain. Which is more than any other place, but it's less than in 2010, right? Because the list has very much opened up. And there's actually, I can say very quickly, another project that's called 10 of 30 that's being done. Javier Serena from El IECID, which is one of the Spanish institutions, they're putting together also a little bit, you know, writers in their 30s, a little bit more like Bogota. There's going to be 30 of them and in their 30s. And each year they're coming out with 10 different writers, and it's only in Spain. And they're doing really wonderful work as well, although they don't prospect as much perhaps as Granta has, that we've gone, you know, down into 23 years old. But we did have a couple of writers that coincided with them as well. Then we had 4 from Mexico, which is a big change from 2010 because there was only 1 in Mexico in 2010. And that was quite surprising to a lot of people. To us too, I mean, you know, but we can only read what we receive, and what we receive and, you know, decide. But something's happening in Cuba, and that is really, really interesting because it's kind of like Cuba somehow coming back into the picture, but it's not a monolithic Cuba. It's the Cuba of still more dissident Cuba, which is in the case of Carlos Manuel Alvarez, who, you know, lives outside of Cuba and has a little bit of a conflictive relationship with the island. But it's also writers like Judith Blanche Savon, who lives in Cuba, is from Guantanamo, is, you know, representative of a Cuban writer in Havana, and he's marvelous. He's a marvelous writer. He surprised all of us. And then there's Danairis, who's also Cuban, and she's in Miami studying, but she's not a refugee. She's not an exile. She's just a Cuban student in the US studying, which is something new and very exciting when you think about it. And if you remember, Gabby, what we were talking about is like all of a sudden we were reading the Cubans and it was like a breath of fresh air. They were fun. Danairis is hilarious. She was so much fun to read her. And all of them, when you read them, it's impossible not to have in your ear the Cuban accent. You read in Cuban. It's impossible not to, you know. And perhaps, you know, we were reading it in some of the really hard times of the pandemic. So when their writing came in, that kind of, in the Spanish, there's that word desparpajo, no? It's like kind of the fun and adventuresome way that they used language just took us all by storm. And there are more. That's one of the things about this issue. You know, we of course make a selection, and because we have, that's our job, is to make a selection. But not all of the great writers that there are can be in the selection because we have to only choose a certain amount of them, right? But I think what this is showing, one of the things that I think all the time is that if you ask me, what did I learn from this? The kids are going to be fine. Oh, right. They're going to be fine. All this stuff that, you know, we get into these ways of saying addled brains and short attention spans and what is everything doing? And you just say, and then you read them and you say, they're fine. They're like really good. They're exploring language in ways that's absolutely extraordinary. You know, the 3 Argentine writers, there are 2 Chilean writers, and then there's a Peruvian writer, Malusca Benavides, who's doing things with language that's absolutely extraordinary. Not only that, she's telling us about a world that perhaps we didn't know as much, which is like a certain generation of Peruvians that came to Lima from the Amazon and from the Andes area. And she's really like kind of bringing back the stories of those people. Or Monica Ojeda, who is, you know, going back into kind of the indigenous cosmopoesis and bringing the stories back from kind of some of those original stories, and in a language that very much makes you feel like she takes Inti Raymi, which is a festival that takes place in the Andes, and it's like the sun god, right? The worship of the sun god, and it's a dancing festival when people dance to exhaustion. And her language, the way that she captures the dancing, it makes you feel like you're right there, that you've been dancing right along with them, just in the language itself. So that's Ecuador. Then, we had two Central American. We also, along with Carlos, is Jose Adiac, who's also dealing with issues about Central America that I think, American writers should read, in the sense that we all know, like, things like the border crisis, right? They talk about statistics all the time. They tell us how many people today, but storytelling brings us back the human, and it reminds us of the experiences of other human beings who are going through these things. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about this issue is that you see the full kind of explosion of the human in all of its different forms in this place, in this language, what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I should remind you, audience members, that we have, tell you indeed, that we have a few minutes before we'll go to your questions. So please prepare them and send them if you can. So a couple of minutes more. While you're thinking of that, I'd like to ask Carlos a bit more about what you're up to, looking to the future. I mean, we've established that the kids are going to be all right. We've established that Spanish is exploding into many different versions of Spanish, and that the colonial language has been overthrown and it is repopulated by indigenous linguistic forms, sort of. But Carlos, what's on your mind? I mean, can you tell us a bit about what you're writing next, or what you're thinking now?
Yeah, well, like it was fun to write this short story because it was kind of like a transitional point. Like, I think, like, from the previous novel, Natural History, where I was already working with some of the themes that appear in this short story, right? Like you mentioned before, ruins, you mentioned remnants, right? And I think that this short story, Ruinas al Revés, which Megan translated beautifully as Ruins in Reverse, deals precisely with that, like, the questions of legacy, the question of like how we take like those like remnants that were left behind, in this case with the case of a hurricane in Puerto Rico, and how do we try to like piece them together and make sense. And I think it really helped me, like, particularly because this was a collaboration with a very good friend of mine that I'm eternally grateful for, Gabriel Piovanetti, a great architect, and he like provided all of the sketches that the character that shares my name finds about these Austrian architect that came to Puerto Rico in the 1940s to kind of like hypothetically sketch the dream of modernity in Puerto Rico, but ends up, sketching rather like the country, like those nightmares or fault lines of that program. And I think that really helped me kind of like move forward to the new novel that I'm writing right now, that I'm like kind of just putting the last touches, because it also deals with the border between art and literature. But I think in Natural History, I was still like, using that Seawald method of including like found images. But now I'm actually like, I'm constructing them alongside like artist friends of mine, and it's incredibly fun, right? To be able to really kind of create an archive. And yeah, I think thematically the same type of like themes that appear in that short story appear also in the new works. So like questions regarding remnants, questions regarding loss, which would be perhaps the tying point with the rest of the amazing writers that appear here. Valerie noted in the introduction that there is like a kind of recurrent motif, completely unexpected, which is children and grandmothers, right? Like yes. Completely unexpected. But I guess, at the end of it all, it's like infancy, and infancy is always related to loss. So I think like in one way or another, like what really kind of like ties everything together is like, these stories of loss related usually to family, and how, the legacy of trying to like take everything that is left behind, those remnants, and try to build something.
Sounds wonderful. I love the idea of constructing found objects, so that finding them by making them.
Exactly.
That's great. I really look forward to that. We have one question already. Please keep sending them, from the great translator Christina McSweeney, translator of Valeria Luiselli, amongst others. She says, Valerie, this is for you. Congratulations on a great publication and event. Well, that's for all of you, particularly Valerie, Megan, and Carlos. In relation to indigenous languages, given the wonderful variety in Latin America, could a further Granta issue include these voices? So not in Spanish, I think you mean, right? It's a great question.
Actually, when we did the 2010 issue, we were surprised that there were few writers from, you know, some of the larger countries, and one of those was Mexico and the other was Colombia, and so and Peru actually had 2 writers, no? So we decided to kind of hone in and find out why that happened. And so we did an issue dedicated specifically to Mexico and another issue dedicated specifically to Colombia. As I was doing that, I was starting to study a little bit, like what other languages are there, and could we find people from these languages so that we would be able to translate them straight into English or into Spanish. But it wasn't very easy. Then I curated an issue on Peruvian literature for Words Without Borders. And we did start, I actually did find, because in Peru, the government is doing a lot of work to recover some of those indigenous stories and the storytelling. The problem is it's an oral tradition. So a lot of them are not written down. And it really would be a lovely thing to do. And I'm fascinated by this. And it's something that I would like to do. So it's really interesting to me, Christina, that you asked that question, because you're touching on something that I'm very, very interested in. I think it is one of the treasures that Latin America has, and to go in and find those stories and be able to bring them out into other languages so that the rest of us can know those stories and read them. And I think it's work to be done, and it's something that I'm very, very interested in continuing.
That would be wonderful. I mean, is it essentially, I mean, I'm trying to think whether, you know, for example, a writer who's writing in Quechua, you know, who's going to be published. I mean, are you talking about sort of publishing them for the first time if you were to find them, or is it essentially an anthropological enterprise, or is it a publication, an editorial enterprise?
That is the question. Anthropologically, it's being done, but editorially is like, we need to take it to another step where they become stories that can be shared with other people, not just anthropological stories to kind of know what the story is. But that's why I think there are certain centers, you know, and I have talked with Ayacid about this. One of my first things was that, you know, I would love to go into Bolivia and find a, you know, creative writing workshop and work with people who are coming from other languages and that are telling their stories from those languages. That would be really interesting. And I think editorially, you would be able to find stories, really incredible stories, because that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing in Jose Adiac from Nicaragua. That's what we're seeing from Monica Ojeda from Ecuador. There are a lot of writers who are writing about this, in Miluska Benavides in Peru. So I think, yes, editorially, not only anthropologically.
Yeah, I do agree. In every festival we do, Latin America, in Peru, Colombia, Mexico, we always have got like a panel on indigenous literature or cosmovisions. We work with McGill University in Canada, that they have expanded a lot all the studies and all the well-keeping of indigenous culture. We do panels, more anthropological panels, but as well there is especially short stories, and there is, as you were saying, Valerie, an interest from governments, a new interest in Peru, and as well in Colombia, of recovering and publishing stories in indigenous original languages. So I think there is a lot to do, and I think there is talent, and there is a new interest as well in writing those languages. You know, so I think there is, you know, we try always to have some some panels to be represented, of course, but there is a lot to do. So very exciting.
Good. Oh, I can feel a collaboration coming on.
Yes.
Yes, let's talk, Valerie.
You heard it here first. So we have a question from Nuria Gonzalez. Congratulations on this publication. Question, I don't know, maybe Carlos, you would be the best place to answer this. How is it for trends that are being published around them? Isn't it true that publishing houses go through cycles and waves of publishing or looking for particular themes or subjects? Would you say you're guided by that, or that it would be important to consider that, Carlos?
You mean at the level of writing? At
Yeah,
the
that's a
of
question,
writing?
isn't it? So whether you're writing to a trend or whether you're, yeah, I think if you, yeah.
No, I think, I think one writes what one wants, right? Like thinking about like the published book would be like the easiest way to get the book killed, right? So it's a very kind of like sacred space, almost kind of monastic, that you have to build around yourself and your book, and then, let that guide you. Otherwise, it will be, because fashions, you always arrive late to a fashion. That's at least my problem, right? By the time that I get there, it's like, like 10 years late. So I think that, it's very important for the writer to kind of like be faithful to himself, to herself, to, to the readings, right? Like one also writes with like the bookshelf, right? One writes like in dialogue with all those people that like one read. So, and those people are, perhaps out of fashion or perhaps fashionable, but I think the important thing is the dialogue.
Thank you. And Samanta Schweblin has sent actually the issue of Peruvian writing. We can't share it now, but it's Words Without Borders. Thank you for that. Nice that you know and it's spotted and as circulating. So yeah, everyone.
And Samantha actually translated Jose Adiac.
There you go.
And
okay.
Christina McSweeney translated Gonzalo Vaz, the Uruguayan.
Yes,
absolutely extraordinary. Yeah.
Mentioning others, but yeah, she's mentioning the Peruvian writers Toussaint and Nikkei. These are languages that I didn't know. So
there are 60 some languages in Peru.
A lot.
It's the richness. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. Samantha, do you speak any of these? I'm asking out into the audience now. I'm quite interested in whether people who are translating into English would speak one of these indigenous languages and could do it directly. Megan, do you speak any?
I was wondering about that too. It seems like the first thing you'd have to do is find a translator from the languages into Spanish,
right? And
maybe work from Spanish into English.
Yeah,
yeah, that would be a project. That would be interesting. But I think those translators do exist. I remember I went to a residency a while ago, and there was a translator there, and this was in Banff. And he was working on putting into text, like creating a written language of his only spoken language that he would then translate into Spanish. It was a way of keeping it alive. I'm not going to try and pronounce the language, but
yeah, I mean, well, this is many years ago, but my mother, who's an anthropologist, was involved in a group in Mexico who which constructed or compiled the first written dictionary of Tzotzil, which is a amazing language. So it's not so long ago. I mean, this would have been in the 60s, that these things were written down for the first time ever. So it would be interesting to get them into this form. Samantha's got another question, another good one. How conscious did the jury have to be this year about finding a better gender balance, note better, than in the 2010 issue? Valerie, I mean, did we consider that specifically? It didn't feel like a problem, but
yeah, no, we really didn't. We didn't, and since, as you know, we did a couple of different deliberation processes. We didn't really count until the end,
right?
So it wasn't on our minds. I really wasn't expecting it to be a problem, personally, because we all know that there's been an explosion of female writers. That I didn't think we were going to have a problem like that. We would have to think about being politically correct or anything like that. And this was one of our most important things in the first list, was when we noticed that there were more men to women we actually asked, what do we do? And we were told, we were given the instruction, be brave. You just, this is supposed to be a radiography or an X-ray, I guess you could say, of the reality and of what you're reading. And, you need to keep it that way. And so that's what we did. But when you look at the numbers after the fact and you count, there were actually, I think, like 160 or 170 men who sent in their candidacies, and there were only like 60 women. So, there isn't a point at which mathematics. Yeah. And this time we got a lot more. There was a lot more women who sent. There were more men than women, but the gap was quite small. And one of the things that we noticed was that a lot of the female writers were from the 90s. A vast majority of the female writers, more female writers in the 1990s than male writers. So what you can see, and literature takes a little bit of time to react to, it takes a little while for these things to happen. But what you can see is that this wave is coming, because in the 1990s, there are more women than men.
Yeah, so interesting. In fact, I was going to ask you what you could tell about the future from this, but you've just answered it. So I'm going to ask you each a different question. Could you each describe this selection, this anthology, in a sentence? Or not? You can't. It's obvious.
Exactly. Not in a sentence. I think it's. I don't know. I think the variety of voices. I like the idea of going away from the neutral Spanish. I like a lot the language, the indigenous words, the different social classes as well. I don't know, that for me has been striking, and that bit especially has been quite striking in this selection.
Yeah, that's good. Megan?
Well, I have to admit, unfortunately, I've read most of it, but I have not finished all of it.
That's excusable.
In terms of what I've read, I would say I'm trying to think of a better word than inclusive, because I feel like a lot of the writers, you get into new spaces like Equatorial Guinea, or even within Chile. Diego Zúñiga is writing about a space that's outside of Santiago. There's the inclusion of different genres. You have a lot of kind of speculative fiction, maybe, or writing about the future, writing about the family. It's I can only think of cliched words like diverse.
That's fine, Megan.
That's how they get to be there. Carlos,
I guess the thing that it drives home is that it's impossible to pigeonhole just by language. There's so much language within the language.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. Carlos, how about you?
Yeah, it's hard. Like I think that I like this idea of reading it as a whole, because you get the diversity, but then you kind of get these motifs that keep reappearing, and then at that level you kind of do feel that there's a generational I don't know, gravitational force that it's strange, but you feel it somewhere, but you can't kind of pinpoint it. So that's kind of what I liked about these things. It's not very clear. It's not exactly this, but you feel it. So that's what I like about the idea of reading it.
Yeah, it's nice. A hunch of some kind. Valerie, you can't possibly whittle it down to one sentence, having worked on this. You have a sentence, please share it.
Well, I would say perhaps it's a music of chance. Because, of course, like I say in the introduction, the jury gets together. It's like playing the Ouija board, no? It's like we all move and we're reading, and it just kind of stops where it stops. And there's an element of chance to the day, to the way that we're reading, to the people that we are together. But that chance then brings together a group of writers. And what these writers, I think we've been able to see, is that there is a music. And that's what I really liked that Carlos noticed about this issue. It's not put together alphabetically, which is like a straitjacket. It's put together following a certain kind of melody and a certain kind of movement to it. And I actually invite the readers in the introduction to try and figure out some of the reasons why the pieces follow the way that they do, because they do create a piece of music, and they create a constellation to them. And so I will just end by saying this is the issue. Judías verdes, ejotes, chauchas, porotos verdes, vainitas, habichuelas.
All the same.
All the different ways of saying green beans in Spanish.
Green beans, yeah. How many green beans is that? Quite a few. Thank you. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much, Carlos, Cristina, Megan, and Valerie, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. Thank you to the British Library, of course, for having us. It's been great. Bye.
Thank you so much, Abby, the British Library.
Thank you.